Hey everyone, this is Chris.
And this is Julia, and we're back with episode number 34 of the Mixology Talk podcast.
So last week we were going over a list of questions that we received from listeners. We came across a really interesting question from Liz from Miami. I won't read her question here because it's pretty long, to be honest. But to summarize, she's curious to know everything there is possibly to know about pour spouts. What's the best kind, how to keep them clean, etc.
So today's podcast is for you, Liz. We're talking all about pour spouts, and Chris is going to fill us in on his recommendations for what to use behind the bar or at home. So today we're going to do a little bit of a different format, and I'm going to kind of interview Chris because I'll be honest with you, I don't have any bar experience, and I think we have a pour spout on our olive oil bottle in the kitchen, but we don't really use pour spouts at our home bar.
Right, yeah, it's usually just for cooking.
Exactly.
And they're awesome for cooking.
They are. That's our first tip. Use a bar pour spout on your home olive oil because it rocks.
Yeah, it does.
So I'm going to be interviewing Chris to help him fill us in on some of the tips for using pour spouts in the bar setting. So first of all, for the rest of us, for the non-bartenders among us, can you just sort of bring us up to speed on what Liz means when she's talking about pour spouts?
Sure, of course, yeah. Sometimes I forget that not everyone knows the industry terms, but when you're in a bar, it doesn't make sense to constantly be taking off the caps of the bottles and putting them back down again. Maybe for your less frequently used spirits, it's okay. But if you're working, in a high volume bar and you're using a bottle in every other cocktail, it's going to drive you crazy and it's going to be really, really slow. Now, on the other hand, leaving the bottle with the top off is extremely risky because bugs could get in easily, and frankly, it's harder to pour at a constant rate. So that's where pour spouts come in. Basically, it's a nozzle that you stick on the end of an open bottle of booze that will help both regulate the flow of the alcohol coming out of it and allow you quick access to your spirits. And we all want quick access to our spirits.
That's really the foundation of this podcast, too.
That's true.
So at home, pour spouts can be useful for the same reason. They give you quick access to your booze. But to be honest with you, you probably don't need them unless you're running an underground speakeasy, in which case, I'm not sure why we haven't received an invitation yet.
Call us.
Give us a ring. For the bar, though, that sounds like a really good solution. So why don't you put pour spouts on everything?
Well, yeah, pours are really handy, but they definitely come with their own problems. So first of all, they aren't a solution for fruit flies. They do make some that have screens on them, but we'll talk about those later. Those guys can still crawl inside, and if you don't close off the pour spout somehow every night, they're going to get in there, and it's going to be kind of nasty. So that means that you're not going to want to have pour spouts on every single bottle of booze in your bar, just the ones that you're going to use the most frequently. Secondly, while pour spouts tend to be a lot tidier than non-pour spouted bottles, they aren't perfect and they do need a lot of cleaning. So if it's not a perfect solution for every bottle in your bar. Finally, you have to keep in mind the expertise of the folks pouring as well. Pour spouts can absolutely help your staff pour more accurately if they're used to the flow rate of a particular pour spout. But if your staff is used to one type of pour spout and you suddenly make a switch to a different type, you're going to throw off their accuracy considerably, especially if you're a free pour bar. So be sure to keep in mind what your staff is used to, and that any changes in that type of equipment is going to definitely require some time and some training to get used to that new rate of pouring.
And for those of us who are not in the bar industry, is it correct? Free pouring is when you're pouring your cocktails and making cocktail recipes without actually using a measuring device. Is that correct?
Exactly. A lot of the time, people will just pour it right into a glass, and they'll use the glass, where it lands in the glass, as their sight line.
The water level.
Exactly. And it's not terribly accurate, but there's a lot of bars that are free pour bars like that. And some of them don't even use pour spouts. They just use it right out of the bottle. So it can definitely differ.
Well, I'm sure that you can be accurate, but it really depends on the skill of the bartender at that point.
Right, exactly.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. So I wanted to dive into a couple of the points that you mentioned earlier and go into a little bit more detail. So first of all, fruit flies. A, that's gross. B, how on earth is that something you can manage? I mean, say you have a well with a bunch of bottles with pour spouts and you're closing down for the night. Can you give us some suggestions on how to keep the fruit flies out without, staying up all night closing down the bar?
Yeah, well, you can buy pour spouts that do have flaps on them. One of the things I mentioned earlier was a plastic one that has kind of a wire frame across the actual pouring portion. And these can definitely help, but I do have my concerns. Full disclosure, I haven't worked with the type of pour spout that has a flap on it in a bar setting, but it seems like those flaps are just going to be one more thing to break. And one more thing that's going to most likely get sticky and covered in alcohol and sugar. The ones with the little wire grates on them, they have a tendency to kind of collect sugar, especially if you're using something like chartreuse or Kahlua or something like that.
I would imagine they would get gummed up pretty easily.
They will over time, and it will definitely affect the rate of flow as well. And if I remember correctly, I haven't used those in years, but the rate of flow is definitely different from the standard metal or chrome looking ones that you see at a lot of bars.
Yeah, that makes sense. While it's something you could get used to, like the flow rate of a brand new pourer with the screen on it, if it's getting gummed up with sugar, that's going to change over time, and there's just no way to stay accurate with that problem.
Exactly.
So if anybody in the audience has experience with the either the flap type of pour spout or the type of pour spout that has the mesh on the top, we would love to hear your thoughts. Since we haven't worked with the type with the flap, I'm curious to hear if you've had any issues with that affecting the actual pour rate, or if they really do get sticky and break. So definitely let us know in the comments at mixologytalk.com/34.
Yeah, I do remember that when I was working in a really high-volume bar, we had special plastic caps that went over each of the alcohols at the end of the night. Essentially, we called them like bottle condoms or pour spout condoms.
Well, that's a good visual.
Yeah, it's not a bad description, actually, except ours were hard plastic and washable. We'd wash a set of caps about once a week.
I'm not going to touch this. I'm just going to let that go.
Yeah, probably best choice. Keep this thing PG, maybe.
Yeah, keep this maybe
PG-17, is that even
PG-21?
PG-21, there you go. But I've also worked in bars where we literally covered pour spout or the bottles with saran wrap. But I wouldn't recommend this approach. It's first of all, it's really time consuming and it's extremely wasteful.
Yeah, I remember you would go through so much saran wrap. It really seemed kind of crazy to me.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like a good long-term solution.
No, definitely not.
So what about cleaning? We talked a little bit about the sort of sticky, sugary goodness that gets in the way of your pour spouts. How do you keep them clean?
You know, it's actually pretty easy. I would definitely clean my pour spouts about every 2 weeks. I do about half the bar at one run and then do the other half of the bar in the next week. So every 2 weeks I would go through the pour spouts.
Seems like a good way to lighten the load.
Yeah, exactly. And as for the cleaning itself, you either wash them in hot water and a little bit of soap, or you can run them through the industrial dishwasher a couple times, and that should definitely help to clean them up. Since sugar is usually what's making them sticky, hot water is going to be the best for cleaning them out. And you really just want to sanitize and remove those sugars.
That makes sense. One of Liz's specific questions was actually about rusting. With those metal pours, have you had any issues with rusting?
So yeah, that could definitely happen. And I used to wash my pour spouts in really, really hot water, like over 200 degrees, the ones that would come right out of the coffee maker.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's pretty, it was boiling at that point. So I would use that hot water and bleach, and it definitely accelerated the corrosion of the metal. So I probably wouldn't recommend that. Now, if you use hot water and normal soap, you should be fine. Just make sure that you dry it off fairly quickly. And, you know, metal and water, they don't get along.
They get along, just not for long.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Just make sure you clean them frequently, rotate out the ones that are broken or corroded, and that should do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I imagine rusting is just kind of something that's going to happen eventually if you're using metal pourers, no matter what, right?
Yeah, pretty much eventually, yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, last question. You mentioned earlier that it's important to take into account what the staff is used to because that'll affect accuracy. Can you give any advice on keeping measurements accurate when using pourers?
So yes, accuracy is a huge topic, and because at the end of the day, the more accurate you are, the better your numbers and the better your business is going to run financially. But I'll try to summarize. You know, jiggers are a great start, but they're not always that accurate. We actually did a video on testing out some of the jiggers recently, and we found out there's quite a wide spectrum of inaccuracies with jiggers.
I was amazed.
Yeah, it was pretty eye-opening. And not only that, but different liquids will pour at different rates through the same pour. Also, the same liquids will pour at different rates through different pours depending on how big the opening is. So there's a lot of little variables that you have to kind of keep in mind, and the key is just to be consistent.
So, do you remember a couple weeks ago we talked about those special measured pourers that always pour the same exact amount? What about those?
Yeah, unfortunately, those don't make a lot of sense for a high-volume bar. First of all, you're probably not going to be pouring the same exact pour every single recipe. If you have 3 different recipes, all using one spirit, one of them could be half an ounce, another one could be a full ounce. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have to be changing out those pour spouts with every time you make a cocktail. So it doesn't make a lot of sense on that. Secondly, they don't solve the problem of different liquids pouring differently. While I haven't formally tested this out, I know that different liquids will pour at a different rate. So it's hard to imagine these pours would be very accurate for all the different ingredients. And the last thing is they're not really easy to clean. They have a little ball bearing that kind of falls when it hits its specific flow or pour, and they all have moving parts. So if things start to get sticky and, start to gum up, it will definitely affect how they work.
Absolutely. It sure just seems like there's a lot of moving parts to get stuck. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So measured pours are definitely good for making the same cocktail lots of times, like at a personal party or something, but probably not the best for a bar.
Exactly.
So Liz also mentioned that her bar was considering investing in an Exacto Pour set to help them with accuracy. What are those?
So an Exacto Pour are a set of training tools that helps bartenders calibrate their free pouring. Basically, it's a graduated cylinder that's hidden behind a plastic cover. The bartender pours out an amount in the top, then turn it around and they can see how accurate they were, or their trainer can tell them, how accurate they were. This is a really common type of training for bars that don't use jiggers. And I've actually seen bars that test their staff weekly, and even some bartenders and bars that calibrate before every shift. Now, if you're going to be free pouring, regardless of the kind of pours you're using, I think it definitely makes sense to recalibrate yourself periodically and double check that you're actually pouring correctly. That being said, I'm not sure you need to spend the money on a branded Exacto Pour set. All you need is a graduated cylinder with the measurements kind of covered up while you're pouring. So I'm sure you can find something to DIY the solution. Or if you just don't have time, the Exacto Pour set is going to be a really, really great solution for that.
Well, I'm not going to lie. I never thought we could talk for, 12 minutes now on something as boring as pour spouts. No offense, Liz or Chris.
Oh, no, I could do this all night. Are you kidding me?
I don't doubt that for 1 second. Just to wrap it up, can you give us your thoughts on the very best kind of pourer out there?
Yeah, now everybody get comfortable because this is going to be a 20-minute monologue of me talking about pours. And so, yeah. Grab a beer and let's get into it. I'm kidding.
Now that everybody has stopped listening.
I'm totally kidding. But the thing is, it actually kind of depends. At the end of the day, the things you look for are you want a pourer that is going to be consistent, it's going to be easy to clean, and it's going to be relatively inexpensive to change out because it's only a matter of time until these things break down, they start looking gross. They're going to need to be changed out quite a bit. So make sure that you get some that are good looking, inexpensive, and have a consistent rate of pour.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Now, as far as the plastic versus metal, they all have their pros and cons. Plastic won't rust, but it definitely does not look as fancy and shiny as some of the metal ones, and vice versa for metal, Now, pour speed may be a huge consideration. If you're working in a really high volume place, you may want to consider a pour spout that has a wider opening at the end, so that way the rate of flow is going to be a lot faster. So that's one thing to consider. Now, if you're more of a kind of a casual bar and you have time to kind of interact with people,
or if you're going for the sort of the craft bar scene.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a high volume craft bar, though,
that's true.
You still
good point.
Want that fast flow rate. So, like I said, it really depends on the environment. Kind of all these other factors. But in my opinion, just find something that works. Make sure that your staff is trained on how to use them properly, and don't change it.
Yeah, it seems like there would be a really high cost to switching out your pours if your entire staff is used to a certain flow rate.
Right. Yeah. And it could be, it could take a lot of time to get used to. Now, if you're using, calibrated jiggers then that will take a little bit of that learning curve away.
That's true. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, find something that works for you and your bar program and just stick with it, and don't change it unless you absolutely have to.
Sounds good to me.
So yeah, that's it for today, folks. I wax poetically, or actually not so poetically, about pour spouts now. Sorry.
I need to go read a book.
Seriously.
So Liz, we really appreciate your question, and I hope that we've been a little bit of help as you try to figure out the best pour spouts for your bar. So please do feel free to send us a follow-up question if we missed anything, or let us know how it went.
Yeah. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts on pour spouts at your bar. What do you use and why? So let us know over the comments over at mixologytalk.com/34.
To all you bartenders out there, have a great shift.
And for everyone else, enjoy their drinks. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.